Hi there, this is Josh from Literary Gladiators, and today I'm here to talk about teachers that have inspired my reading. Because this is Teacher Appreciation Week, I thought that it would be the perfect opportunity to talk about the teachers that have had some kind of inspiration on my reading in some way, shape, or form. And there were all different periods of time and in so many different ways, because I think that reading is a very important attribute, not just to education, but the acquisition of knowledge. I think that in order to become a smarter, a wiser, a more well-informed, and a better person, books, reading, and literature have a lot to do with the pursuit of moving forth with those particular things. But I'm going to be talking about, I would say, 3 to 4 different periods of my life. There is the public school days, which is up to 3rd grade. My private school days from 4th grade to 12th grade. You could say there's a bit of a split, but as far as high school is concerned, there's not as much detail, so I'm just going to blend that in with the private school days. And then there's college days, which incorporates the many years that I went to college. So let's get started. First, I'm going to talk about public school days, which is preschool to 3rd grade. And I would say that the first the beginning of my interest in reading took place in pre-kindergarten in Mrs. Hawes's class, because the way that she arranged activities associated with reading, while in many cases I've seen that when teachers read to their students, the students are sitting on the floor, whether they're sitting with their legs crossed, or they're just sitting, and teacher's in the chair, holding up the book, showing everybody the pictures. But our class was small enough that we were able to sit around a table and the teacher would read to us there. And Mrs. Hawes had some good selections when it came to books, one of which I talked about in Works from Childhood, and I brought it up a few other times, called The Ghost's Dinner. I bought a copy of it for $16. It is in used condition, but it is a piece of nostalgia that I wanted to own, and I wanted to reread it as well. It's just amazing how clever and outside of the box the book is, with how anything they eat they turn into the particular color. For instance, when they had pumpkin soup, they all turned orange. And then we would do projects based off of what we've read. We would color in the ghosts the particular colors depending on what they had eaten, and then follow along as she read the story again. And then we also read The Very Hungry Caterpillar, where we made a edible caterpillar out of biscuits, and she used raisins for the eyes, which I'm not necessarily a big fan of the raisins, but the biscuits were good. And then we had to recreate the first scene in the book using... one thing I remember is the egg at the very beginning. It was a very little egg, and we made it out of dough. And then I would say that for the... I would say that during my public school days, We had a library class, Mrs. Wynick, who introduced me to Pretzel, and Mrs. Nelson is Missing. All very memorable, classic children's literature. The Giving Tree was another one. There was Mrs. Grant, who was my speech therapist, who incorporated reading into my learning. She was helping me create sentences, so I would be doing... she would give me a book and have me review it, which essentially I would review it. It was more so summarizing, but in a way that's the beginning of me reviewing books, per se. And I would say that leading up to going into private school in 4th grade, I was introduced to some good children's literature that served as a foundation. I was more into reading about things that interested me, nonfiction, in areas that were of interest, such as the presidents. But one thing that should be noted is Dr. Seuss was not a huge part of my reading. Dr. Seuss, we observed his birthday on March 2nd each year, and it would lead to the incorporation of something that he has written, or things that he had written in as a collective, but I was never into Dr. Seuss's books. I was into Eric Carle's books, but Dr. Seuss was not. I know that he popped up here and there. I know that one of the teachers dressed up as the Cat in the Hat for Halloween. Someone else dressed up as Clifford the Big Red Dog. But it was not but Dr. Seuss was not a major part of my reading as a kid. Now we're going to move on to the private school, which I would say that the first one that really showed enthusiasm for reading is Miss Rickert, who I wasn't a big fan of novel reading class. I was not a big fan of reading novels, but Miss Rickert showed a great deal of passion for what it was that she was talking about, and to the point that I can recall the Boxcar Children chapter after chapter. I could probably do my best to tell you what the chapter was called, or if anything, what the chapter was about. And I think that Miss Rickert's strategies really were helpful in that matter. Miss Halvis, and how she made reading, the way that she taught was just so extraordinary. The assignments, the quizzes, the tests, the examples that she gave, and the activities that she put together. We read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. We read The Borrowers, and then we read some humorous books that were of different kinds, which those I remember as well, and I enjoyed that. But I would say that when it came to reading literature, Miss Marmero's reading class is the one that really stuck with me, because reading classes, I almost thought that the stories were written in order to fulfill the lesson. But starting in the 7th grade reading class, we were using a book where we were going over actual works of literature. We were going over O. Henry. The scripts were also fun when they made them into play format, because they rearranged the pimento pancakes so that it read as a script. There was Langston Hughes' Thank You Man, which has been a story that has stuck with me. William Sororin's works have stuck with me. I would say that the one that really had an impact was when we read The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. That's probably the short story that began my passion for the exploration of literature. And then in 8th grade, we read a lot of Stephen King novels for our novel reading class. While I would say I wasn't a big Stephen King fan then, in a few years' time, I became a huge enthusiast for Stephen King's novels. But it has to start somewhere, and I would give Miss Lyman with the directorial strategies by Mr. James, I'd give them credit. And then I would say that in high school, the English class that did the most for me was American literature with Miss Mauer, Miss Anita, and Mr. Kevin Finn. But we went over so many good things, and Miss Mauer and Miss Anita, and I would say even Mr. Kevin, they primarily taught through handouts. They taught the way that they wanted to teach. They were a bit rebellious when it came to when it came to their methods. A lot of them went by the book, but a textbook feels that I feel that English is not meant to be taught through a textbook, because it gives you pretty much English and literature is supposed to be based off of perception. Now, there are some things that have clear answers, but there's so much that does not. And a textbook feels that everything has a clear answer, and it's their answer, but it's not. And I feel that if you're teaching people that way, it's going to turn them away from wanting to read for pleasure. And I think that class encouraged me to explore reading much more. We went over Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne. We went over Robert Frost, Walt Whitman, the Transcendentalists, Mark Twain, Emily Dickinson, I believe, and so many more. And then we read The Crucible as our book, which our activity was to create a comic based off of it, and I had a great time with that. I just typed in Abigail drinking chicken's blood on Google, and I got this blonde Marilyn Monroe looking woman who was drinking a red alcoholic drink, and the teacher thought it was hysterical. And then Giles being smothered by rocks. There was a play version and a toy Giles, and this whole pile of styrofoam from rocks, and that came out good too. It was fun to put together. Now we're going to move on to college, which it was during this time where I realized that I wanted to major in English, and I also felt that the journalism degree that I was originally going to go for didn't do enough to fulfill the reading and writing aspects of what I wanted to study, but instead it required more broadcasting and math and science, which I wanted to steer away from. But As far as English is concerned, I'm going to confess that I did have to take a remedial. It wasn't as bad as math, where I had to take two of them, but I took English 95, which comes before English 1. But I would say that it was essential to my studies. English 1 and 2 were a breeze. I had solid A's in both classes. But English 95 I felt was more challenging in a very good way, and I think a lot of that I owe to Mr. Murphy, who Mr. Murphy's goal is to make us better writers, readers, and thinkers, and he succeeded at doing that and then some. He incorporates whip-arounds at the beginning of class that can either... The topics that we had to go over ranged from something that we were going over in class, such as the different modes of thinking, or these different things that we were most guilty of. There was, and then some of them were just trivial, such as if you could be an animal, or a book that you read that made an impact on you. One of the most memorable ones was where we had to create the formation of a research paper, and everybody did the Great White Shark assignment. I was one of two people that did not, and when I told him I wasn't going over that one, he started to applaud, which those are some good memories. And we were able to meet up again on Facebook. He's just... I really had a great time in his class, and he's just a great guy. I think that in English 2, Mrs. Rogalski did a lot to inspire my love of literature. She went over each area, the prose, plays, poetry, and then we did a major paper on a novel that we had to present to the class. And I like the fact that if we had an A going into the final, we would be exempt from doing it, and I was able to assure that I was able to claim the A and get the exemption from the final exam. There was the literature club, and meeting Jay Henneke was a huge inspiration. Jay Henneke was a professor in English and philosophy, but he was probably, I would say he was the most easygoing instructor, but you got so much out of him because he was, I would say, I would use the term blue jean scholar, but he was remarkable and so outside of the box, and he still is too. And it's really interesting to have discussions about literature with him. And then there is Professor Sullivan from British Literature 2. I got a lot out of the discussions and the activities that we did in her class. She teaches during the day, she teaches middle school English, I believe, and she teaches a college class during the evening as well, each semester. And I got so much out of the different assignments that she gave. We went over Romanticism, we went over Victorian literature, Robert Louis Stevenson, Oscar Wilde. her big one was the Heart of Darkness activity with the Joseph Conrad piece, and whether or not we should or should not teach it. And I remember being the one holdout. I refused because I'm very much for leave it up to the teacher to decide which one that whether or not they should teach it. And then the Virginia Woolf activity, where we had to stare at a particular image and then write about exactly what was going through our minds as we were looking at that image, and then equate it to what Virginia Woolf was thinking when she was looking at the mark on the wall. And it just really it really gives an honest depiction of the human mind. And the last teacher that I wanted to talk about is perhaps the one that probably had the greatest impact when it came to the direction in which I went as far as my reading is concerned, and that is Dr. Bordelon. I think that he was the most instrumental in broadening my horizons and expanding my interests when it came to books, reading, and literature. When I first started taking his classes, I was taking 5 English classes that semester. The only one that wasn't reading-based was the creative writing class, and I knew that going into this class, it was going to be challenging, but it was in a good way. I was going to work my tail off, which I would say that the first major moment that I realized that Dr. Bordelon was going to make an impact was when he asked me to stop by his office so that he could look over one of my papers, which the way he did his papers, he asked us to write not an introduction or a conclusion, but just a paragraph that would be featured in a paper on a particular subject, and then he would look it over, and then he showed great concern on what we were getting out of the class, how were we making out, and it really he showed a great demonstration of how much he cares about his students' progress and their interest in the classroom itself. He does teach annotating, which I annotated for the class, and I annotated for other college classes if I was using a textbook. But as far as my own books go, I still do not annotate in them. I'll write in a notebook my thoughts, but I will not write in the books. That's just not my thing. But with Dr. Bordelon, I would say that he is the primary reason that I became interested in poetry. I constantly make mention to the fact that when we went over Howl by Allen Ginsberg in American Literature II, I realized that literature has no boundaries, and poetry especially has no boundaries. At first I had thought that in order for poetry to be studied, it had to be constrained and professional in the way that it had to be clean. But Allen Ginsberg really turned that upside down, and it has an equal amount of merit, and I feel that the examples of media that Dr. Bordelon used, from playing the Israelites in one of his classrooms to showing us a scene from Ratatouille where Remy's eating the strawberry and the cheese, and when he puts them together, something magical happens. That has stuck with me as well. And we've had Dr. Bortle on plenty of times on our show, and we plan to continue to have him on the show. And I feel that he is the reason why his discussions are the inspiration to Literary Gladiators. I wanted to take it a step further with a web show where each of us demonstrates our chemistry and places that into discussions of particular works and the great range of works that literature has to offer, not just books and novels, but also short stories, poems, plays, essays. And I think that Dr. Bordelon's classes had a lot to do with the flourishing of this channel. Thank you for tuning into this video, and I want to thank all of the teachers, especially those that have inspired the reading of their students years on end. And I'm pretty sure that so many other booktubers have so many teachers that they can talk about and the inspiration that they have given them to get into books, reading, and literature. Just want to give you a big thank you. Thank you for tuning into this video, and for now, keep reading.